afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Institute. It is my great pleasure to introduce Shanker Singham, whom I have known for a couple of years and whose work I have long admired in the field of international development. Shanker has an enormous amount of experience in the whole field of trade, competition, and regulatory systems. He has been involved as an international trade lawyer and has been associated with some of the most prominent law firms involved in their market access practices. Most recently, a top 10 global law firm, Squire Sanders, and he's also represented a number of multinational companies and governments. He has been an advisor to the U.S. Trade Representative and the Department of Commerce, and has been a non-government advisor to the International Competition Network. He's been a senior trade and economics advisor to a number of political candidates, and now he is the managing director of the Competitiveness and Enterprise Cities project at Babson Global, which is the commercial arm of Babson College, which runs one of the most prominent business schools in the United States. So it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Shanker, and without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Thank you. Thank you very much, John. Well, thank you very much for having me, and thank you, John, for organising this. What I thought I'd do is, first of all, to give you a bit of background on the Competitiveness and Enterprise Cities project. My background is as a lawyer and economist. I was a lawyer for 20 plus years with large global law firms around the world, starting in London and Brussels and then moving to Latin America and Washington. And I joined Babson with the Competitiveness and Enterprise Cities project, brought it into Babson about 2 years ago. And I really did that and left the practice of law because of the previous 25 years of experience and working around the world, and some lessons that I think we had learnt. And I was very privileged to have been at the coalface on a lot of these issues. So, sorry, let me just get this going. So, what I work on is competitiveness of countries and economic competitiveness. We have worked on about 70 or 80 countries around the world. My background, as I mentioned, is as a lawyer and economist. We started with the privatization of the UK electricity industry in the late 80s, early 90s. These are the Thatcher reforms, one of the first privatizations of any electricity industry anywhere in the world. The Chileans actually were first, but the UK got the credit for doing the privatization of the UK electricity industry. We then went in, when the wall came down, to the former Soviet Union and did a lot of work on the transitions of the former Soviet Union. We wrote privatization laws in Lithuania and Latvia. We did the EU accessions representing the European Union. We did the EU accessions of Hungary and Poland in the early 90s. And in September 92, with the Apertura in Latin America, I went to Latin America, and or at least I went to Miami, which is basically Latin America. And then I worked on the transition in Latin America from a import substitution model to a market economy model. And from an economic standpoint, the transition from the command and control model in the former Soviet Union to the more market-based system, and the transition from the import substitution model in Latin America to a more market-based system was similar. The economic forces were similar. And what we essentially tried to do in that work, and then after that we worked on China WTO accession, worked in India, and the final thing that I worked on in my legal career was back to almost the beginning, which was Russian WTO accession. So we've done a lot of work around the world on these transition issues. The fundamental forces that we talk about here are what we believe as a result of this experience are the critical pieces of economic development around the world. So open trade, competitive markets, and property rights protection. I mean, property rights protection is the basic, sine qua non for all of this to work. And so property rights protection first, and then competition and open trade. Now, what we learned from the transitions in the former Soviet Union and the transitions in Latin America in the 90s, we did the first of those and the third of those reasonably well. The countries were opened up to trade, property rights reasonably well done, at least compared with competition. But a total disaster on competitive markets inside the border. And that has set up the world that we live in now, and that has set up the problems that we have now. Now, everyone at the time made the assumption that open up the border to trade and competition will automatically follow. And that was, at the time, a reasonable assumption to make. And it's not as if there were a whole host of people at the time saying that that wasn't going to work. So, but because competition inside the border failed, we created a world where the beneficiaries of distortions, economic distortions inside the border, became much, much greater, proliferated around the developing world and emerging markets, and created the conditions, the preconditions for crony capitalism and a lot of what we see in developing countries and emerging markets. There was an interesting paper in Foreign Affairs recently by an unknown academic, and it's not clear whether he's a Chinese academic or an American academic in China, but under a pseudonym. Essentially, the comment he made was partial reform is the friend of crony capitalism, and that's really what we saw in the 90s and 2000s. And so these fundamental laws that I've listed there, that are not a surprise to anybody. I mean, obviously, wealth can be created or destroyed. It's much easier to destroy than it is to create, and competition is the most powerful force that actually creates it. Those sort of fundamental laws were largely forgotten in this period. So what I wanted to do here is present what the problem is, and then present to you what our solution is, and then talk about the linkage between what we think the problem is, what the solution is, and national security of the United States, but also national security of other countries around the world. So on trade, the record on trade is very, very good. I mean, there are problems, there are barriers, but generally the record on trade is very, very good. And a measure of that is global GDP, which grew by a factor of 2 between 0 AD and 1913, grew by a factor of 10 between 1947 and 2001. So in a 50-year period, 5 times the global growth that you'd seen in the previous 1900 years. And most of that, too, is obviously the Industrial Revolution. So there is a long period of virtually no growth in the world in the first sort of 1,000 years after 0 AD. So trade has produced enormous economic benefits. It created in that period the multinational system. It created the multinational company. It created global supply chains. It created a lot of efficiencies in the system that liberated and created a huge amount of wealth and lifted a huge number of people out of poverty. So border barrier reductions were done relatively well from a very low base. In other words, the tariffs were very, very high when they were brought down, and the beginnings of behind the border barriers were dealt with. So you had, even in the 1947 GATT, you had provisions on state trading enterprises that even now are being analyzed and used in the context of China's state-owned enterprises, trying to understand what the Article 17 of the GATT, which is the article on state trading enterprises, what that actually says, how it can be applied to Chinese SOEs. And then, of course, you have the creation of the EU, you have NAFTA, you have a bunch of other agreements. The original vision, though, it is important to note, is the original vision of the International Trade Organization was the old ITO, was a much more comprehensive agreement than we have had for the next sort of 40 or 50 years. The ITO was intended to cover property rights, it was intended to cover intellectual property, it was intended to cover competition, and it was also intended to cover other things that would not have been so productive to economic growth. But it was intended to be a comprehensive agreement. The ITO agreement essentially failed because of issues of sovereignty, and so what we were left with was a contract. So the GATT and the succeeding trade rounds through the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s were building on a contract, an agreement, basically. Sorry, let me just go back here. So the Uruguay round in 1994 was the high water mark of the international trade negotiation. And bear in mind what's happening now. It's 1994. The Euro round was launched in 1986. So 86 to 94 is the period of negotiations of the Uruguay round. During that 8-year period, you saw these massive transitions going on in the world. You saw the wall came down, you saw the transitions of the former Soviet Union, and so there was a huge impetus to create some vehicle that countries would then accede to. And that led to the most comprehensive trade round to date, including agreements on services, agreements on intellectual property. TRIPS is the agreement on intellectual property, agreement on investment, TRIMS, and then everything stopped. What happened then was you had every 5 or 6 years after a trade round is concluded, generally a new one starts. Trade is often referred to as a bicycle, that if you stop pedaling, you fall over. This period that we've had since the conclusion of the Uruguay round to now, and counting, 20 years and counting, is the longest period we've ever had without the negotiation or the successful conclusion of a global trade agreement. And partly because of that, we're seeing a lot of measures by countries that are mercantilist in nature. We're seeing countries not really prevented from enacting trade violative rules and measures. Even the Bali package, which is a package of trade measures that is intended to deal with only something as obvious as trade facilitation, the movement of goods through customs. Even that India managed to oppose, and that fell by the wayside. So the Doha round has been a tremendous disappointment, but again, you've got to look at fundamental forces. The Doha round is a tremendous disappointment because it was never really around to start with. You'll all remember the 1999 WTO riots in Seattle, where I was present. There was great opposition, and what happened in the 1999 Seattle ministerial was an announcement by the US administration that they could envisage labor sanctions being brought into play for trade violations. So obviously developing countries objected to that, and the round essentially fell apart. The only reason Doha was launched, frankly, was 9/11. I mean, the Doha round was launched a month after 9/11, when the world came together for a brief moment to try to do something, to recognizing it was important to get the trade negotiation process back on track. But there was never any consensus for the Doha round. It was also wrongly called a development round, not because development is bad in the context of trade, but because it essentially pitted the developing countries against developed countries and made this erroneous sort of assertion that the reduction of trade barriers by a developing country was somehow a concession that was given to, that essentially was given away. So trade, and you've got in your slides some information from Aditya Martu's work at the World Bank that shows the the scope for tariff reductions in the Doha round. And then we go to the transition markets. Property rights and border barrier reduction, as I said, but not competition. And this is created, you have in your material a paper that I did in Concurrence, which is a European journal of trade and competition, law and economics, a paper on what we have christened anti-competitive market distortions. And essentially, anti-competitive market distortions are government restraints that distort markets in anti-competitive ways. Not every government action is a distortion. Not every government distortion is anti-competitive. But there is this class of barriers, this class of activities by governments that does actually skew the playing field in terms of competition. And by skewing the playing field in terms of competition and damaging the competitive process, again, going back to my first slide, what that does is it destroys wealth out of the economy, it damages consumer welfare, and it reduces economic activity and productivity. So what then happened is we see a lot of these distortions either continuing to exist. Some of them are relics of import substitution. We see them continuing to exist. But we see nothing really preventing them from proliferating, and they proliferated in the 90s and 2000s. A lot of these are things like local content requirements, local working requirements, essentially trade barriers that countries can't do because of the trade rules have retreated inside the border to become regulatory protection and regulatory distortions. You can see this with things as different as European GMO regulation, which is really designed to protect a particular group of farmers in Europe, but by under the guise of a health and safety type regulation. And many of these regulations are in those areas, which makes them very pernicious and very difficult to deal with, because they appear to have a good reason for existing. And but in reality protect a local interest. I mean, there are some very obvious examples, like the very famous Japanese baseball bat case, where the Japanese enacted a rule that said that baseball bats had to be a certain length, and coincidentally, it was exactly the length that Japanese manufacturers made, and led to US baseball bats sitting in Japanese customs houses for long periods of time. Most of these anti-competitive distortions are not as obvious as that. They're much, much cleverer. And they're much, much more difficult to deal with, and consequently much more pernicious. Competition agencies, we also saw in the 90s a rise in domestic competition agencies. So agencies whose function is to promote a competitive market and to enhance consumer welfare. These agencies sort of were created in the 90s. There were about 2 of them in 1990 itself. There are now over 100. Most countries now have a competition agency. And competition agencies, when they are doing what they are supposed to do, which is create competitive conditions, create competitive markets, are a force for good. But too often what happens is they become used, and again this comes back to the sort of fundamental forces issue, which really runs through this whole presentation, that if you have a competition agency in a country where those fundamental rules that I set out at the beginning are not believed in, are not followed, then your competition agency is simply going to become another tool of government restraint. So if you look, for example, at China's new antitrust agency, which is very much used to damage the interests of foreign multinationals, but is totally quiet when it comes to China's state-owned sector and administrative monopolies. It's sort of, a competition agency can either be a brake on anti-competitive government practice, or it can be an accelerator in some cases. And in the US, we've seen a trajectory of the FTC and DOJ in the early stages in the 30s and 40s being, frankly, a tool of anti-competitive outcomes, believing, for example, that a fragmented market by itself was a good, and therefore breaking up big companies was the role of the competition agency. It is only when economics sort of came into play in the 1960s and 70s that it was realized that actually that there was no economic theory that suggested that that was a good thing. And in fact, the pursuit of monopoly, not the abuse of monopoly, but the pursuit of monopoly was the business process, was the ordinary business process. Every company wants to corner the market. There's nothing wrong with that. What's wrong is when they do corner the market and then they act in anti-competitive ways. That's a different issue. But these new competition agencies, because of the power dynamics and the political dynamics that Distortions had created, were unable to control anti-competitive distortions. So what's the solution? So essentially, what we're seeing around the world is an enormous amount of wealth that is being destroyed out of economies on a daily basis. You also have a paper there, which a report we did for the Council on Foreign Relations, which we consider, even in the US, maybe 15% at least, 15 to 18% of the US economy is destroyed every year because of distortions. These are, for example, Buy America rules, local content rules, all kinds of different things. So that's the problem. The problem is that huge amounts of wealth are being destroyed in the world through these distortions, that vested interest elites and incumbents, entities and oligarchs and so forth in countries around the world who benefit from distortions are preventing the reform process. So what's the solution? The solution obviously is what it's always been, which is nationwide, national level reform. But national level reform is incredibly difficult to do for all of these reasons. When I started, and we did work in Russia in the early 90s with the privatization process, many of the oligarchs that now are very powerful, were mid-level government bureaucrats who understood the licensing mechanism, who understood the privatization process, and frankly, begged, borrowed, or stole licenses, and that was the basis of the business. Well, a $10 million beneficiary of distortion in 1993 or 1994 is now a $10 billion beneficiary of distortion, and such an entity will fight very hard to prevent any kind of reform that would take away their economic power, and that is what happens in countries around the world. But the oligarchs are not just sort of in that area. You also have other elites that fight against reform very effectively. The most notable group in developing countries and emerging markets that have extremely inflexible labor market systems where it's impossible to hire or fire workers, this sort of thing. Any attempt to reform labor markets meets with massive opposition as well. And if I had a dollar for every labor minister or economy minister who's lost his job because he's attempted to do labor market reform in developing countries, I would be much richer than I am now. So that's the reality now, and as the World Bank, that's a World Bank statistic, 90% of global capital flows to 12 countries. So the vast majority of global capital does not flow to developing countries and emerging markets, even though the returns in developing countries and emerging markets are much, much higher. So why is this happening? It's happening because of all these distortions in developing countries. And a significant crony capitalist sort of problem. Why does all this matter for national security? Well, we've got a world where right now we have had for a long time a projection of stalled growth, stalled economic growth. You go back to even 2004, 2005, and we haven't seen real economic growth. And we've seen this sort of stasis. Well, what this has done in the developing world and the emerging markets is it's created this massive unemployed youth demographic in countries all over the world. And there are no good points that one can point to. You can look at the reliable engines of growth. Historically, the US and Europe were reliable engines of growth. They're not reliable engines of growth anymore. And more recently, China, whose growth rate of 8 or 9% sustained a huge amount of economic development in the world, even though it was based on distortions to some extent. Well, China's growth has also gone down. So, and future engines of growth, like India, are not are not growing either. They are not reforming quickly enough. Now it's going to be very interesting to see how Prime Minister Modi's good rhetoric translates into actual action, because the action we have not really seen yet. And reforming India is a challenge. So we have a distortions index, a productivity simulator, that essentially what we've created. And if you look at those papers that I've left with you, one of the things that we've realized over the last sort of, I guess, 10, 15 years is that unless you can actually put numbers to the cost of distortion, it's very difficult to have this argument. It's very difficult to show policymakers what they're essentially leaving on the table. And so we've worked on figuring out what the metric to measure distortion could actually be, and we've developed a productivity simulator. It's still in its early stages, but one of the things that this has enabled us to do is to put real numbers on these losses, at least in terms of productivity percentages. So if you look at countries around the world, now we've simulated 130 countries around the world. If you look at this group of 130 countries, the bottom 5, in other words, the countries that are the least distorted, are the ones you'd expect to be the least distorted. It's Singapore, it's Hong Kong, it's New Zealand, Finland, the UK manages to get in there, which was surprising to us, but is nevertheless in the top sort of 5 to 8. What's interesting is the US has dropped in the last 4 or 5 years. The US is now ranked sort of number 19-ish, 19, 20 around the world. But it's still an undistorted market compared to the rest of the world by and large. So what you see here is the countries, and you can't really see this too well on this thing, but the lightest colours are the undistorted, the least distorted markets. The darkest colours, the very dark blue, is the most distorted markets in the world. And this map tells you some very interesting things. First of all, it gives you a sense of how distorted the world actually is. And that these very light-coloured countries are very rare. Now, by the way, this does not mean that Afghanistan is not distorted. It means that there is very little data for. So some of these countries in Africa and the Stans, we don't have good data for. So we're developing that process now. But these are obviously countries that are highly distorted, all of them. So if you can imagine a map where all of this is dark blue and this is dark blue. You only have a handful of countries around the world that can be classified as not particularly distorted. Even these countries, though, have room to lessen their distortions. It does also tell you one interesting thing about Europe, which is, the conventional wisdom with respect to Europe is generally, all of these countries are generally operating in roughly the same kind of economic environment, etc., etc. And for trade, that is true. But for competition and for distortions, it's not true at all. So you have the UK and you have the Scandinavian countries that are relatively undistorted. But as you go down, even France and Germany, you start to see the blue is getting deeper. Okay, so there's big differences between the Franco-German core of the European Union with respect to distortions and the Scandinavian countries, the UK and Switzerland. And then by the time you get down to Italy and Greece and Spain and Portugal, the colour is deepening. So consider the European Union, consider the difficulties that the European Union has been facing. It's not surprising when you look through the lens of distortions to see why these problems that the Eurozone is facing and that the European Union is facing, because they're really very, very different economies when looked at through the lens of distortion. Obviously there are some things here that are not surprising at all. Most of Africa is highly distorted. Venezuela, within Latin America, Brazil. I mean, you can see all this. I mean, and Southeast Asia, there are tremendous distortions as well. India is highly distorted, more so, in fact, than China. China's actually improved a lot in terms of distortions. It still has a high level of distortions, but compared with India, it has actually improved. I will come back to the numbers on that slide in a second. But again, in terms of national security, well, I don't need to tell you this. So you've got this youth unemployment rate, you've got a high degree of potential failed state scenarios in countries. You look at places like Honduras, you look at the stands, you look around the world. I mean, there are a huge number of places that are ripe for that kind of failed state scenario. And we're not seeing any kind of growth that is lifting the rest of the world. So this is sort of the problem. And when I took the Competitiveness and Enterprise Cities project into Babson, what we thought about is, how do we solve this problem? I spent 25 years, trying to do national level reform. And I came to the conclusion that national level reform had become much more difficult, not easier, much more difficult to do. So we sort of looked at the world and what was going on in the world, and we looked at these statistics that you all know but are terrifying. Almost a third of the children who live in the world have no shelter. 3 billion people on less than $2.50 a day. 2.6 billion no access to sanitation, 25% of people living without electricity. And then you have a statistic like, China lifting 600 million people out of poverty, admittedly from, again, a very, very low base that was a self-inflicted wound. But nevertheless, the poverty rate in China fell from 85% to 15.9%. So you've got this environment that we're in. And then you've got some global trends that are going on. You've got a massive wave of urbanization, people moving from the country to the city, billions of people moving from the country to the city, and new cities being created all over the world. So you have 500 new cities being created in China, you have 100 new cities being created in India. But even in a place like Morocco, where I was recently doing a presentation, they have 15 new cities that are being created out of nothing to accommodate this huge shift in demographic, which could either be a good thing, depending on what the conditions in the city are, or it could be a very bad thing, depending on what the conditions in the city are. You have a huge infrastructure need that governments cannot pay for. You have $60 trillion almost of infrastructure need around the world. Governments can't pay for this. But you also have a world awash in cash. You have a world with $30 trillion of cash on the sidelines, undeployed, not being deployed anywhere. I represented, before I left the law firm, Intel, Microsoft, DHL. At one point, Intel had $100 billion of cash on its balance sheet, burning a hole in its balance sheet, unable to know what to do with this huge amount of money. And not able to deploy it because of a lack of investor trust, a lack of trust in these environments. But at the same time, you do have these growth engines that do actually exist. You've got Hong Kong, you've got Singapore, you've got the square mile of the City of London, you've got Dubai. Now, the Hong Kong, Singapore, Dubai, you can understand. London, you might think, well, London's pretty old. Why is London on this slide? The square mile of the City of London is actually different from the rest of London. It actually has a different regulatory environment in financial services. It has regulatory autonomy. It has a security service that is answerable to the corporate board that runs the City of London Corporation. And it even has, and this is classically English, it even has somebody called a remembrancer, who is the City of London's chief lobbyist, whose job is to protect the City of London from foreign governments. And foreign governments are Brussels, obviously, but Westminster is also a foreign government. And so for a long time, in fact, until 1944, the City of London had its own appointed MP, not elected, appointed MP, who sat in the House of Commons to defend the rights of the City of London. And the City of London's rights go back a long, long way. I mean, Magna Carta, which we celebrate this year, 800 years, talked about the ancient rights and privileges of the City of London. When William the Conqueror came to England in 1066, he had to essentially accept the rights and privileges of the City of London. So this is a very long-standing set of fiscal autonomies and other autonomies in the City of London, but it's served London very well. And so these entities are generally governed by regimes that do these three things that we talked about earlier. They protect their open trade environments, they protect property rights, and they have competition policy as an organizing principle as the economic system. So merit-based competition, the idea that you succeed or fail based on your quality of your ideas and hard work, and not on your connections to government or distortions or any of these other things, that's really the, for the most part, I mean there are exceptions of course, but for the most part, and again comparative to other countries, that's what distinguishes them. They have an inviting environment for entrepreneurs, for capital providers, and that's largely why they are successful. I had worked for about 60 or 70 governments around the world, and so I worked with or against. And so we took this idea of, governments generally want to do reform. Most governments generally want to do reform. They know what reforms are. They know what they need to do. There's no secret in what kind of reform would generate economic activity. The problem is a political problem. The problem is that they can't do it. The problem in developing countries is also that the government very often is a sort of veneer around the oligarchs, and therefore there really isn't a government really to deal with. So the notion here is, can you actually take some of these zones that are being created around the world, these new cities that are being created around the world, and at least try to have a partially reformed regulatory, legal and economic environment in these zones, rather like the City of London, the square mile of the City of London, rather like Hong Kong or Singapore or Dubai, which were these things. I mean, they basically were a different regulatory environment, a good regulatory environment in the middle of a very bad region. And because they were in a very bad region and they were a good environment, they became a magnet for global capital, they became a magnet for the supply chain. So could we do this a bit more intentionally than these things that just emerged? And the way we do this is we identify the constraints to economic activity in these countries by across the dimensions of trade, open trade, competition and property rights protection. We advise the elimination of these constraints, and we also show countries what the benefits are of actually a more pro-competitive system in terms of the economic activity that's produced and the productivity that you'll actually see. One of the problems in the reform process is that there are no end of people who will tell countries, you need to reform your intellectual property laws, you need to reform your insolvency laws, you need to reform all of these things. There's no shortage of people telling countries what will actually generate economic activity, but no one is telling them what economic activity will actually be generated. And because we live in a world that, I'm always telling my colleagues and students that there's this tiny group of people in the world, economists, who live in a sort of non-zero-sum world where economic interactions between people grow the pie. And then there's the 99% of people who live in the world who think it's zero-sum. And unless you get that, unless you sort of break that fundamental assumption, you're not going to make any progress. But even governments and even economists in developing countries, when they look at economic distortions and they look at non-zero-sum interactions and see the pie getting bigger, they recognize, most of them, that the pie can be bigger or smaller. What they don't really recognize, again, is the scale. And so most people assume that if the pie is like the size of the base of this bottle, when it gets bigger, maybe it gets a little bit bigger, a little incremental sort of piece bigger. What our data is showing is if the pie is the size of the base of this bottle, what is achievable, what is the gain, is the size of this table. It's a huge gain. The gains from trade are about 2 to 3%. The gains from reduction of distortions are far, far bigger than that. And to reflect back on the world map that I showed you with the highly distorted markets, our simulator, which is 90% accurate, and just to compare, so when we regress it back on global GDP movements, it shows 90% accuracy in predicting GDP movements based on the weighting and the factors that we use. Compare that with the World Economic Forum GCIs, the Global Competitiveness Indicator, which is about 19% accurate. So this is a very robust economic tool, and it's been written up in a number of papers. What it shows us is that bottom 5 countries, the ones that are the least distorted, even Singapore could gain in productivity terms by about 150% through the reduction of its distortions. So that the bottom few are 150, 200, 300% gains in productivity. By the time you get to the Tajikistans and the Kyrgyzstans and so on, you're talking about a 5,000% increase in productivity potential. Now remember, this is a ceiling. This is the highest you could possibly have. So that map of the world, the 130 countries in the world, is about an 1,100% increase in global GDP if distortions are reduced, are eliminated across all those countries. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. But we talk to countries about this, and we're in negotiations right now with about 15 countries around the world who want to create these kinds of zones. Obviously, we work with who you'd expect us to work with. There's a number of development organizations that are interested in doing this sort of work. I will say, though, of course, that development organizations are very slow-moving and are far too slow-moving for this kind of work to be successful. It has to be essentially solving the problem of the $30 trillion on the sidelines and the $60 trillion of need. And that is private sector infrastructure development. And it has to be creating an investor proposition that the private sector will then spend the money on, because they're spending the money in other places. And so it's a question of lowering the discount rate for those countries to the point where you start to flip some investor decisions. And so the timeline for building this is relatively quick. It's we have a number of governments that have MOUs and letters of intent with us to actually create this. They don't commit to anything, they commit to simply evaluating it. We've launched our diagnostics in a number of places. And then we construct a regulatory framework agreement with the government, which essentially sets out the investor proposition. What are the rules in these places? Now, there are a number of countries that are doing this anyway. I mean, if you look, for example, at the Special Economic Zone at Duqm in Oman, the Omanis have recognized that there are two significant barriers to economic development in Oman. One is the 35% Omanization requirement. You have to have 35% of your workforce has to be Omani. One is a local law that protects local distributors of foreign products, gives them enormous protection, so you can never fire your local distributor. And of course, what this does is it creates a lack of competition at the distribution level. It makes prices higher. It's bad for consumers. But the Omanis have recognized that these are two barriers, and so in the zone they've eliminated them. If you look at Tangier in Morocco, which is the number 14 port in the world. It's the number 14 port in the world in a country that's very poor. The poverty rate in Morocco is 15%. It's the number 14 port in the world because what the Moroccans have done is remove the cabotage restrictions. You know, the Jones Act type. You know, you must have a domestic flag carrier to dock at the port. They've removed those restrictions. They've removed the crew member nationality requirements just for that zone, and they've created a port that is much more effective and much less costly than anything around the region. So this is kind of like the timeline. This is not a long timeline. I'll zip past that. So when we talk to countries, we talk about, what could you do in a zone? So there are free trade zones, there are special economic zones, there are all of these things. What could you do? You could have a zone that is what I call eCity 1, which is you deal with the World Bank Doing Business Index. You solve for that. You make it easy to register a business, you make it easy to register a mortgage, you do all those things. You could do eCity 2, which is you have some opening to foreign investment in certain sectors. You have better insolvency rules, you have better IP rules. And eCity 3 is the full reduction of these distortions. So pro-competitive energy sector, telecom sector, all the rest of it. What's interesting in this is that eCity 1, the World Bank doing business stuff, which is what politicians around the world obsess about. They obsess about their position in the World Bank doing business index, makes virtually no difference to productivity. And in fact, the more distorted you are, the less of a difference it makes. So if you're India and you fix, for the whole country, you fix the World Bank doing business stuff, you make it easy to register a business, you do all this, the productivity gain in India is 0.002. It will not move the needle. And Modi is focused on this. So if he does it and the needle doesn't get moved, he's going to have to explain why. And the reason, of course, is that if you have a highly distorted market with a regulatory system that's biased in favor of incumbent companies and so forth, as you do in India, then if you fix the World Bank doing business indicators, all you're going to do is create lots of lemonade stands that survive for not very long, can't really make it in the country because there's no access to capital, because you've got inflexible labor markets and all of these things, and you will not succeed. ECD 2 for most countries is about 150 to 100% productivity increase, but it's ECD 3 where the huge gains are, and that's the gains I talked about in terms of productivity gains between, up in the thousands of percent. Most developing countries are around anywhere between 1,000 and 2,000% increase in productivity. So we explained to governments with the simulator what they could have. One of the problems in reform is that people are very good at understanding how to incrementally grow things, how to improve a particular law or regulation slightly. They're very bad at looking at what is missing entirely. So the Moroccans, I was with Morocco recently, and they want to be an air hub for Africa and Southern Europe, which makes a lot of sense, and it certainly is their future. But they think they are an air hub. So we pointed out to them that they were 1% of Dubai, and so they're not really an air hub. There's a lot of missing potential, and in Africa, people are still flying from one African country to London to get to another African country. So there's a huge potential here. We talked to them about, all you need to do to create an air hub to eliminate the distortions is to give an increased number of air freedoms, 6th and 7th air freedoms, pro-competitive slot allocation at the airport. Don't favour the incumbent all the time, giving them the best slots, et cetera, et cetera. Pro-competitive slot allocation. You just do those two things. And the simulator that we worked on with the Moroccans shows that they could have a $1.2 billion air hub. You don't do those things, and you will have a $200 million air hub. In other words, you're leaving $1 billion on the table, which may be a good and legitimate government action if you want to protect Royal Air Maroc. But you've got to do that trade-off. Is it really worth it? Is it really worth $1 billion being left on the table? See, now they've got an actual weighing they can do, as opposed to what they had before. So in Morocco, the ECD 3 is a 3% GDP injection into the country, creates, very conservatively, 100,000 jobs, and lifts about 600,000 people out of poverty. So, again, there is an exponential dimension to reduction of distortions and solving for the constraints that affect developing emerging markets. There's a huge amount of economic activity that is still on the table. Again, what we found around the world is this sense that, well, we've really exhausted all the ways to grow economies, and we're really at the end of the line. This period of growth between 47 and 2001 of 1,000% increase was unusual in human history, and we're never going to see anything like this again. And so projections that economists are making for global growth are typically around 150% global growth up till 2030. But as I said before, if you actually reduce the distortions, the level of global growth is potentially an 1,100% increase. So somewhere between 150 and 1,100% are choices. They're choices that governments make. They're choices that people make. And what does it represent? It represents lifting 800 million people out of poverty, out of absolute poverty. 2.5 billion people above the $2.50 level of relative poverty. And what does it look like? Well, we actually know what it looks like, because first of all, we've seen periods of massive global economic growth. We haven't seen them all, but humanity has seen them. The move from hunter-gatherer societies to Neolithic villages is actually a much bigger level of growth than this. It's a 128-fold increase in productivity, admittedly over a long period of time. But then we have the Industrial Revolution, and we have the GATT system growth of the late 1950 to 2000, about 1,000% growth there. But the best example that we have, actually, of that kind of level of growth, 1,100% increase in growth in a short period of time, is really what we've seen here in this country, with, for example, Fairchild Semiconductor coming out of MIT and Caltech and so on, and creating companies every day. That's what it looks like. Intel produced on one day, AMD the next day. I mean, all these companies that were produced that gave rise to Silicon Valley happened because access to capital, flexible labor market, IP protection, open trade, all the things that the US delivered in Silicon Valley enabled this company to grow at that kind of rate. And so in emerging markets and developing countries, where the critical barriers to growth are those things, are lack of access to capital, because there's a lack of competition in the banking sector because it's controlled by the oligarch who runs the banking sector, and consequently the lending rate is 15%, whereas in the UK it's 0.5%. You're not going to get entrepreneurial activity in a country like that. You're not going to get business scaling in a country like that. You're not going to get employment in a country like that. Flexible labor market. If you can't fire people, you can't hire people. And so if you're an entrepreneur and you're trying to build entrepreneurial activity and you can't, and you're worried that if I make the wrong decision, I hire the wrong group of people and I have to pay millions of dollars in severance payments, redundancy payments, etc., I'm not going to hire them in the first place. So lack of flexibility of the labor market is a key issue. And then things like property rights protection, IP protection, all of these things that our simulation was sort of picking up and showing are major sources of economic activity. So I'm going to stop there. I want to leave you with, if there's a single theme that runs through this, it's that we are very optimistic about the world, and that's maybe somewhat unusual. We're optimistic about the world because there is so much gain possible, particularly in developing countries and emerging markets. And yes, the problems are serious, and yes, the consequences of a failure to grow economies and create jobs and create opportunities are incredibly serious from a national security dimension. But at the same time, it's not as if there is a world where there's nowhere to go. I mean, there's a huge potential gain in this world. So I'll leave it there and I'll take questions.